I've got one word for you. We said that romantics were fascinated by the past, and we discussed old religious buildings, ruins around the British landscape. But they also looked back much further to the classical past, to ancient Greece and Rome. But there was something new to this interest in the Romantic period. Until the end of the 18th century, Britain had preferred the example of ancient Rome. But then something happened. The French revolutionaries modelled themselves on the Romans. They suggested that they were recreating the best examples of the Roman Republic in the French Republic. Conservative British intellectuals felt that they couldn't do what French revolutionaries were doing. If French revolutionaries had adopted Romans as their models, it meant that Britons couldn't do the same. So they turned to the example of ancient Greece instead of Rome. They took a new interest in the culture of classical Greece, particularly 5th century Athens, and of course the epic poetry of Homer. One example of this romantic Philhellenism, or love of Greek culture, is Percy Bysshe Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, which is a rewriting of and sequel to the Greek tragedy Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus. Aeschylus' play Prometheus Bound was one part of a trilogy, the rest of which is now lost, leaving space for Shelley to imagine how the whole trilogy would have unfolded. Greek tragedy is the origin of the Western theatrical tradition, but the special importance that Romantics found in Greek tragedy recognized that tragedy was originally a religious ritual. It was a spiritual experience. To understand how tragedy functioned as a spiritual ritual, we could look at the work of the 20th century anthropologist René Girard, who wrote a book called Violence and the Sacred. In his book, Girard suggests that humanity has an inherent tendency towards violence and that we need to channel it somehow, and that sacrifice was derived so that we could channel our violent impulses onto a sacrificial victim. Girard reads tragedy as a form of sacrifice. We watch characters suffering on stage so that we don't have to suffer ourselves. Traditionally, a Greek tragedy will follow a number of conventional stages. We begin with a crisis or a scenario in which something is very wrong, usually the consequence of hamartia, or the protagonist's tragic error. The protagonist undergoes catastrophe or a reversal of fortunes, often going from a position of elevation and respect to one of degradation and humiliation. The result of this transition is catharsis or purgation. A kind of metaphorical social illness has been purged. And you'll notice that catharsis is a medical term, signifying the spiritually cleansing work of watching a tragedy. We may learn something morally from the destruction of the protagonist. We learn that pride is mistaken and that doubting the gods leads to terrible consequences. But more important than the moral lesson is the spiritual experience of crisis and resolution, as though watching catastrophe on stage can replace the need for catastrophe in our own lives, that we undergo the experience with the protagonist, and it is no longer necessary for such destruction to occur in our own lives. Now I want to give you a curious fact of cultural history. Every time America has started a new war, such as with Vietnam, with Iraq, it has coincided with a surge in productions of Greek tragedy in the United States. The point is that particular historical moments find a cultural affinity with Greek tragedy, and the Romantic period was one of these. Romanticism is primed for a reception of Greek tragedy. The historical strife of the Romantic period is especially suited to make people take interest in drama that mediates suffering, explores destruction. Shelley's Prometheus Unbound is what is called a closet drama, that it was written to be read, it wasn't written to be staged. Critics often say that the Romantics are bad at writing plays because they are too interior. Romanticism is too inward-looking, too brooding, and this isn't dramatic. Drama needs to be external. Shelley's Prometheus Unbound is the only attempt by a major Romantic author to rewrite a Greek tragedy. But there are elements of Greek tragedy everywhere in works by Romantics in other forms. There are Greek tragic aspects in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, even though that's in ballad form, it's not a tragedy. There are aspects of Greek tragedy in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, in Keats's poetry, in Byron's works. They turned to Greek tragedy anew, reinventing it in different ways, because they felt that Greek tragedy, if not on the stage, was somehow in its message eminently suitable for the concerns of the Romantic era.